The directors of Pye Ltd sat in Cambridge and surrendered their independence. The signature was formal. The buyer was Philips of the Netherlands. With that single agreement, one of the most powerful wireless engineering empires in Britain ceased to be its own master. The name survived. The autonomy did not. A company that had employed thousands on the banks of the River Cam, building both the infrastructure of British broadcasting and the receivers that caught it, was quietly absorbed into a pan-European corporate machine. A decade earlier, that same name had meant precisely the opposite. Pye was not merely a consumer manufacturer. It was a British institution. If a police car patrolled a London street, it communicated through a Pye two-way radio. If a family gathered in a sitting room to listen to the home service, the heavy wooden cabinet glowing in the corner often bore the Pye badge. They built the broadcast transmitters. They built the mobile telecommunications. They built the beautiful valve radios that defined the post-war domestic evening. They possessed the total engineering confidence of a firm born in the shadow of Cambridge University. But the real story of Pye of Cambridge is not simply a corporate acquisition in 1967. It is the story of how unshakable British engineering independence collided with the unforgiving realities of the global electronics market. It is the story of rising domestic manufacturing costs, the brutal transition from heavy valve cabinets to cheap imported transistors, and the harsh truth of mass production. A radio that tuned beautifully, built by generations of skilled local labor, could still lose the high street shelf if the company behind it could no longer afford the cost of its own ambition. Every week, we tell the stories of British radios, wireless makers, and listening habits that once shaped how people heard voices, music, and memory, and what happened when the market moved on. Subscribe if that history matters to you. The story begins not with nostalgia, but with a specific place, inside a scientific instrument workshop in Cambridge in 1922. The story begins in a city defined not by mass production, but by academic exactness. Before it was a brand on a high street shelf, Pye was a surname attached to scientific instruments. In the late 19th century, William George Pye walked out of his position as the head workshop technician at the Cavendish Laboratory, the physics department of the University of Cambridge, to establish his own business. W.G. Pye and Company built galvanometers, resistance boxes, and precision measuring tools. They worked in wood, brass, and copper. They did not build things for entertainment. They built things for measurement, designed to satisfy the ruthless standards of Cambridge physicists. For more than 2 decades, the company remained a respected but small scientific instrument maker. But in 1922, the atmosphere above Britain changed. The British Broadcasting Company was formed. Transmitters began to electrify the air with scheduled voices and music. A new domestic object was suddenly required in the British home: the wireless set, an older British term for a radio receiver that brings broadcast signals into the home without a physical program source. Yet, in 1922, the British listener faced a profound absence. A family wanting to hear the evening program from London had to invite an industrial mess into their sitting room. Early wireless reception was not an elegant affair. It required a tangle of copper wires, heavy glass accumulators leaking highly corrosive acid, large high-tension batteries, and exposed components that looked exactly like what they were: an experiment. The domestic sitting room was a place of polished furniture, floral wallpaper, and controlled order. A crude early valve radio, a radio that uses glass electronic valves to amplify and process signals before the transistor era, felt like an intruder. It was difficult to tune, dangerous to maintain, and ugly to look at. The British market lacked a receiver that married the precision of a laboratory instrument with the aesthetic grace of domestic furniture. W.G. Pye's son, Harold, along with his former Cambridge tutor, the physicist Sir Edward Appleton, saw the gap. They realized that a wireless set did not have to be a fragile hobbyist's toy. It could be engineered. In 1922, inside their Cambridge workshop, the men of W.G. Pye and Company applied their scientific exactness to the reception of broadcast audio. They built their first receivers. They did not merely assemble bought-in parts. They manufactured their own components to ensure reliability. The dials had to move smoothly. The valves had to be mounted securely. The tuning capacitor, a component that changes the circuit's tuning so the radio can select one station from many, had to track the signal without drift. By 1924, this Cambridge philosophy took a physical form that would become an icon of the British High Street. Pye introduced receivers featuring the Sunrise Grille. A grille is the opening or fabric-covered area through which sound leaves the radio cabinet. Rather than a simple hole cut into a wooden box, the front of the Pye cabinet featured an intricate wooden fretwork cut into the shape of a rising sun, its rays bursting outward from the center. It was a masterpiece of domestic camouflage. It hid the industrial reality of the loudspeaker, the part of a radio that turns the electrical signal into sound moving through air, behind an Art Deco motif that looked entirely at home on a mahogany sideboard. Early British reception to these Cambridge-built sets was defined by a quiet, immediate respect. Radio dealers and high-street shopkeepers quickly realized that a Pye wireless set rarely came back for repair. However, this scientific pedigree came at a steep price. Records suggest that in the mid-1920s, a complete Pye multi-valve receiver could easily cost upwards of £23. In an era when the average British weekly wage hovered around £3, a Pye radio was an immense domestic investment. It was not a casual purchase. It was a statement of intent, bought by middle-class households who wanted the new BBC voices delivered with total reliability and handsome cabinetry. The demand outstripped the capacity of a scientific instrument workshop. The reception of voices from the ether had ceased to be a novelty and had become a national habit. To survive, the Cambridge firm had to change its structure. In 1929, the radio division was spun off entirely, and Pye Ltd was formally established. They moved into a dedicated factory site in Chesterton, Cambridge, leaving the original scientific instrument business to operate separately. Within a few short years, Pye had transformed from a maker of university laboratory equipment into a serious industrial manufacturer of domestic electronics. They had proven that a wireless set could be a piece of fine furniture, and that tuning into the BBC could feel like operating a precision instrument. But establishing a reputation in the 1920s was only the foundation. To truly conquer the British market, to move from the wealthy parlor into millions of ordinary sitting rooms, Pye needed to engineer a product that would redefine what a radio could do. By the mid-1950s, the British domestic wireless market faced a crisis of clarity. The evening airwaves had become an overcrowded battleground. Medium wave, a broadcast band historically used for many domestic radio services, was filled with the heterodyne whistles and electrical interference of a recovering, industrializing Europe. Interference, unwanted noise or disturbance added to the signal, was routinely ruining the BBC home service. Listeners in London flats and suburban sitting rooms found that their pre-war sets could no longer pull a clean voice out of the dark. The British Broadcasting Corporation understood the problem. In May 1955, from the Rotham transmitter in Kent, the BBC officially launched its regular VHF-FM service. VHF-FM is a radio band that gives clearer sound over shorter distances than older AM bands, eliminating the background hiss and crackle of electrical storms and nearby factory machinery. But this new, pristine signal was useless to the millions of older receivers sitting in British homes. The public needed a new kind of machine to catch it. They needed a receiver built for high fidelity. Pye of Cambridge did not merely participate in this transition. They engineered a definitive statement. They introduced the Fenman series, named in honor of the flat, sprawling fenlands that surrounded their Cambridge headquarters. And at the top of this new range sat the Pye Fenman Pye Ltd. 2. A masterclass in post-war British acoustic engineering. The Fenman 2 was a table radio, a radio designed to sit on furniture rather than be carried in a pocket. But the term table radio barely captured its physical presence. It was a massive, imposing piece of domestic architecture, housed in a deeply polished dark walnut veneer cabinet, the wooden body that holds the radio's components and shapes its appearance. It measured more than half a meter across. When placed on a sitting room sideboard, it dominated the room. The front of the cabinet was a study in functional authority. The listener was presented with a vast, illuminated glass tuning dial, the scale or display that shows which station or frequency the radio is tuned to. The glass was printed with the names of European cities and the new VHF frequencies, glowing warmly when the set was switched on. Behind the glass, a heavy flywheel was attached to the tuning knob. When a British listener turned that knob, it did not feel light or cheap. It possessed a smooth, weighted momentum, adjusting the internal tuning capacitor, a component that changes the circuit's tuning so the radio can select one station from many, with the absolute precision of a Cambridge laboratory instrument. To help the listener locate the perfect center of the new FM broadcasts, Pye included a magic eye. This was a specialized valve, a glass electronic device used to control and amplify signals before transistors replaced it, that glowed a brilliant, luminescent green. As the listener approached the correct frequency, the glowing green bands of the valve would physically close together, providing a visual confirmation of perfect tuning. But the true breakthrough of the Fenman 2 was what happened when the signal finally reached the loudspeaker, the part of a radio that turns the electrical signal into sound moving through air. Pye engineers refused to rely on a single source of sound. The Fenman 2 contained an intricate acoustic arrangement featuring multiple drivers, the moving parts of a loudspeaker that physically push air. It housed a massive main speaker facing forward, accompanied by smaller tweeters mounted on the sides of the cabinet. This created a three-dimensional wash of sound that could fill a large room with a rich, uncompressed audio quality previously unheard of in standard domestic sets. It featured independent tone controls, the controls that changed the balance of bass and treble, allowing the listener to shape the output of a symphony on the third program, or the sharp diction of a newsreader. This level of engineering commanded a formidable price. In 1955, the Pye Fenman 2 retailed for roughly 31 guineas, more than £32 sterling. At a time when the average British weekly wage was roughly £9 to £10, purchasing a Fenman 2 required over 3 weeks of a working man's gross salary. It was an enormous financial commitment. Yet, the British public bought them. The Fenman 2 became a symbol of middle-class domestic arrival. It achieved its distribution breakthrough by dominating the high-street electrical shops and independent radio dealers. In towns across East Anglia, the Midlands, and the South East, local dealers placed the glowing Fenman in their shop windows. Retailers like Curry's proudly stocked Pye sets because they knew the Cambridge engineering was reliable. Reviewers in respected enthusiast publications like Practical Wireless and Wireless World praised the Fenman 2 for its exceptional sensitivity, how well a radio picks up weak signals, and its selectivity, how well a radio separates one station from nearby stations. The high street service engineers, the men with soldering irons who kept British radios working after the sale, also respected Pye. When they removed the back panel of a Fenman, they found a heavy metal chassis, neatly routed wiring, and high-quality valves. Pye had built a profound British radio moat. They controlled their own manufacturing destiny, utilizing components from their own subsidiaries and assembling the sets with highly trained local labor. They did not have to compromise. In the mid-1950s, a Pye radio glowing in the corner of a darkened British sitting room represented the absolute zenith of domestic valve technology. The listener, sitting in an armchair, watching the magic eye close on the Rotham signal, knew exactly what they had paid for. The badge on the dial was not decoration. It was a promise about reception. By the late 1950s, Pye had achieved something few British manufacturers could claim. They had enclosed the entire ecosystem of British broadcasting. They did not just build the receiver in the sitting room. They built the cameras that captured the television image, the transmitters that broadcast the signal, and the communications networks that kept the country moving. They were no longer merely a Cambridge radio maker. They were a sovereign industrial empire. To understand the scale of Pye during this era is to look at the physical map of East Anglia and the British High Street. The original Chesterton site in Cambridge had expanded into a massive, humming industrial complex. Available reports indicate that, at its peak, the wider Pye Group employed upwards of 30,000 people across its various divisions, international subsidiaries, and associated factories, with the beating heart remaining firmly in Cambridge. The city was transformed from a quiet university enclave into a powerhouse of domestic electronics. Hundreds of local workers sat at long factory benches, meticulously soldering components and assembling printed circuit boards carrying electronic components and copper tracks that connect them, with the same disciplined precision their predecessors had applied to scientific measurement. Pye sets dominated the shop windows of independent radio dealers from Glasgow down to Southend-on-Sea. High street electrical shops, including the rapidly expanding branches of Curry's, Dixon's, and local co-op electrical departments, stacked Pye cabinets near their front doors. They relied on the Pye name because it sold, and it sold because it carried the intellectual weight of its university town origin. But Pye's absolute dominance extended far beyond the domestic valve radio, a radio that uses glass electronic valves to amplify and process signals before the transistor era. In 1947, they had established Pye Telecommunications, almost universally known as Pye Telecom. If the consumer radio division owned the British evening, Pye Telecom owned the British working day. They pioneered the mass development of two-way mobile VHF-FM communication. Within a decade, their professional equipment was ubiquitous. If a metropolitan police car pursued a suspect through London, the officer spoke into a heavy black Pye microphone. If an ambulance rushed to a hospital in Birmingham, the driver was directed by a Pye dashboard receiver. Taxi ranks in Manchester, fire engines in Oxford, and commercial delivery fleets across the home counties all relied on Pye Telecommunications equipment to operate. They built a parallel network of invisible radio waves that kept the post-war British state functioning. This commercial dual monopoly, ruling both the consumer sitting room and the professional vehicle dashboard, gave the company an aura of absolute invincibility. Cambridge engineered the circuits. The BBC and the Home Office generated the signals. The high street dealer network sold the consumer sets. The British public made listening a daily habit. The Pye badge, with its distinct rounded typography, became an ironclad guarantee of reception. It was stamped on massive, highly polished radiograms, a piece of furniture combining a radio, amplifier, loudspeaker, and record player in one cabinet, that sat proudly in wealthy suburban front rooms. It was attached to smaller bakelite receivers, sets made from an early hard plastic, strong and moldable, that played the light program in ordinary homes. From the intricate, hand-wound copper coils of a tuning capacitor to the heavy magnets driving their loudspeakers, the engineering was resolutely, proudly domestic. A thriving service network, the shops, engineers, and repair counters that kept radios working after the sale, supported this vast output. A local high-street engineer opening a Pye set knew exactly what to expect. Logical layouts, robust transformers, and service manuals written with academic clarity. Pye did not just participate in the British electronics market. For a brief, shining window in the 1950s, they dictated its terms. The absolute peak of Pye's empire, however, arrived with a profound shift in how Britain listened. For decades, the radio had been a heavy, static piece of furniture. But in the mid-1950s, the science of reception shrank. The transistor, a small electronic component that controls or amplifies signals with less heat and power than a valve, arrived from the United States. Many British manufacturers viewed the early transistors with suspicion, believing they were too noisy and expensive for serious domestic audio. Pye did not hesitate. In 1956, through their subsidiary brand, PAM, Pye released the PAM 710. It was the first commercially produced transistor radio, a portable radio that uses small semiconductor devices instead of valves, making it lighter, cooler, and more battery-friendly, ever manufactured in Britain. The Cambridge engineers had beaten everyone to the shop window. Soon, the Pye badge itself appeared on a vast new range of portable sets. The radio was abruptly unmoored from the sitting room wall socket. It became the British kitchen radio, a small domestic radio used as part of everyday household routine. Housewives listened to the light program while preparing meals. Teenagers carried Pye portables into their bedrooms to hunt for pop music. Families packed them into the boot, the storage compartment at the rear of a car, alongside picnic blankets. Pye had successfully managed the most difficult technological transition in consumer electronics. They had carried their reputation for heavy, university-grade engineering into the new era of lightweight plastics and printed circuit boards. Their ambition seemed limitless. The company expanded heavily into television manufacturing, producing sets that sat alongside their radios in millions of homes. They established Pye Records, pressing vinyl for British pop stars. They built the cameras that filmed the studio broadcasts, the transmitters that sent the signals, the televisions that showed the pictures, and the radios that caught the voices. To sustain this massive output, Pye expanded far beyond their original Cambridge borders, opening huge new production facilities, including a major electronics factory in Lowestoft, Suffolk. The assembly lines ran continuously. Industry estimates suggest that during this peak period, Pye was manufacturing hundreds of thousands of receivers annually. By the early 1960s, Pye of Cambridge was not merely a manufacturing firm. It was an independent British media conglomerate. At the height of their scale, to look at a Pye radio was to look at a triumph of domestic industry. Picture a Pye transistor set sitting on a Formica kitchen worktop in 1963. The plastic cabinet, the molded body that holds the radio's components and shapes its appearance, was perfectly finished. The tuning dial was clear and responsive. The internal ferrite rod aerial, a small internal component often used in portable radios for medium-wave reception, was highly sensitive, easily pulling in the BBC Light program or the fading, distant signal of Radio Luxembourg across the North Sea. Every dial, every room, every voice. It was a completely enclosed system of British trust. The designer in Cambridge drew the circuit. The local factory worker in Lowestoft or Chesterton soldered the board. The high street shopkeeper sold the box. The British public turned the volume control, the knob or slider that changes the loudness of the sound, and believed that the company providing their daily entertainment was invincible. They had the scale, they had the engineering, they had the high street, but an empire built on such vast, uncompromising infrastructure requires an immense amount of capital to sustain. Pye had mastered the science of reception. They were about to be overwhelmed by the mathematics of global retail. The decline of Pye of Cambridge was not an overnight collapse. It did not happen because the Cambridge engineers suddenly forgot how to design a receiver. It happened because the British radio market structurally changed beneath them, and the vast, uncompromising infrastructure Pye had built became too heavy to sustain. By the mid-1960s, the company was fighting a war on multiple fronts, caught in the grip of overlapping market forces. The first was the unforgiving mathematics of domestic manufacturing. British radios required cabinets, wood, plastic molding, transformers, loudspeakers, tuning dials, aerials, capacitors, transistors, printed circuit boards, testing, packaging, shipping, and skilled local labor. As component costs and domestic wages rose, Pye discovered a brutal retail truth. A well-built radio could still tune beautifully and still lose the high street shelf because it cost more than the mass market wanted to pay. Pye had pioneered the British transistor radio, a portable radio that uses small semiconductor devices instead of valves, making it lighter, cooler, and more battery-friendly. But by pioneering it, they had inadvertently helped to untether the radio from the domestic sitting room. Once the radio became portable, it became a commodity. This opened the door to the second force dismantling the Pye empire: imports, private labels, and the era of good-enough listening. Through the 1960s, a wave of inexpensive Japanese and Hong Kong transistor radios flooded into Britain. These imported sets were smaller, cheaper, and mass-produced on an unprecedented global scale. A Pye portable radio, assembled in East Anglia with robust British plastics and carefully soldered printed circuit boards, boards carrying electronic components, and copper tracks that connect them, was engineered to last for decades. But the new listening public did not care about longevity. Teenagers wanting to listen to the new pirate radio stations or the latest pop singles did not need university-grade acoustic engineering. They did not need a heavy, wooden-cased table radio, a radio designed to sit on furniture rather than be carried in a pocket. They needed a cheap plastic box that could find a medium-wave signal under the bedsheets. The cheaper imported radio did not need to last for a generation. It only needed to find the station. High-street electrical shops, once the proud domain of the Pye dealer network, began to alter their window displays. The profit margins on imported electronics were highly attractive to retailers. Pye sets suddenly found themselves sitting next to cheaper, unbranded or imported equivalents that cost significantly less. The Cambridge firm was fundamentally incapable of building a cheap, disposable radio. Their entire corporate identity was predicated on precision. This structural inflexibility meant they began to lose volume sales just as their financial overheads reached their absolute peak. The British turning point, the moment the trajectory of the Cambridge Empire permanently changed, was triggered not by a radio, but by a catastrophic miscalculation in television. In the mid-1960s, British broadcasting underwent a massive technological shift with the introduction of BBC Two on the UHF band, using a new 625 line picture standard. Pye, confident in their manufacturing might, produced an enormous stockpile of highly complex dual-standard television sets capable of receiving both the old and new signals. They ran the factories at full capacity. They filled their warehouses. They waited for the British public to rush the high street shops. The public hesitated. The rollout of the new television service was slow. The programming was initially niche, and buyers held on to their existing sets. The massive mountain of unsold inventory sitting in warehouses across East Anglia crippled Pye's cash flow. They had tied up millions of pounds in stock that was not moving. The debt mounted. The banks grew nervous. The company that had once dictated the terms of the British electronics market was suddenly hemorrhaging money. By 1966, the financial situation in Cambridge had become untenable. The directors realized they could no longer afford the cost of their own independence. A bitter, highly publicized boardroom battle ensued, effectively destroying the internal cohesion of the firm. In 1967, the inevitable occurred. Pye Ltd was acquired by Philips, the colossal Dutch electronics multinational. Philips bought a controlling interest, injecting the desperately needed capital to clear the debts. But the price of survival was the soul of the company. The immediate aftermath was not a dramatic closure of all facilities, but a profound and irreversible loss of sovereignty. The decisions about what to build, how to build it, and where to sell it were no longer made exclusively on the banks of the River Cam. They were now subject to the pan-European corporate strategy of Philips. Pye had ceased to be an independent British manufacturer. It had become a regional subsidiary. For the consumer on the high street, the Pye badge remained on the tuning dial. But the era of absolute Cambridge autonomy had ended. The retreat was about to begin, and it would slowly dismantle the physical geography of the Pye Empire, factory by factory, until the name meant something else entirely. The Philips acquisition of 1967 was publicly framed as a rescue, a necessary injection of capital to save a vital British institution. In reality, it was an absorption. Philips was a vast, highly efficient multinational corporation with its own established supply chains, its own factories, and its own global design philosophy. They did not buy Pye to preserve a proud tradition of Cambridge University-grade radio engineering. They bought Pye for its enormous British market share, its television distribution network, and its highly lucrative telecommunications division. For the first few years under Dutch ownership, the illusion of independence was carefully maintained. Pye continued to release radios, televisions and radiograms, pieces of furniture combining a radio, amplifier, loudspeaker and record player in one cabinet that were designed and built in Britain. But as the 1970s progressed, the structural reality of pan-European manufacturing began to dismantle the Cambridge Empire. Philips looked at the balance sheets and saw redundancy. Why should they pay to maintain separate design teams, separate cabinet makers, and separate production lines in East Anglia when they were already mass-producing identical electronics in their own global factories? The logic of international corporate consolidation demanded rationalization. The British factories were too expensive to run, and the local labor was too costly to employ when compared to emerging manufacturing centers in Asia. This relentless drive for efficiency triggered the most insidious phase of the company's decline: brand dilution, the weakening of a brand when its name appears on products that no longer match the original identity. Through the 1970s and into the 1980s, the Pye badge was systematically detached from the physical reality of Cambridge engineering. It was repurposed as a mid-tier marketing tool. If a British listener walked into a high-street electrical shop in 1978, they could still buy a product with the word Pye printed on it. But that product was no longer a heavy, walnut-veneered table radio with an intricately tuned internal chassis. It was increasingly likely to be a cheap, plastic-cased clock radio, a small radio combined with an alarm clock, often used beside a bed, or a generic portable cassette recorder that had been manufactured overseas. The internal printed circuit boards carrying electronic components and copper tracks that connect them, were no longer laid out by the men who had built the Fenman. The tuning dial, the scale or display that shows which station or frequency the radio is tuned to, no longer possessed that weighted, smooth momentum. The sets were hollow. They were lightweight. They were simply Philips designs or bought-in Asian models wearing a historic British disguise. The high-street radio shops, the independent dealers, and the service engineers, the men with soldering irons who kept British radios working after the sale, understood exactly what had happened. They opened the new plastic cases and saw generic, imported components. The deep reservoir of trust that Pye had built over half a century evaporated. The company was no longer viewed as a premier domestic manufacturer. It had become a budget label, forced to compete on price against a tidal wave of cheaper Japanese, Taiwanese, and Hong Kong imports. As the consumer brand was hollowed out, the physical geography of the British Empire was steadily erased. The massive manufacturing facility in Lowestoft, which had once employed thousands of local workers to build British televisions and radios, faced severe downsizing and eventual closure. The sprawling Chesterton complex in Cambridge, the historical heart of the company, was slowly stripped of its domestic manufacturing capabilities. The sprawling benches where generations of local women had meticulously soldered radio circuits were cleared. There was one exception to this collapse, but it only highlighted the tragedy of the consumer division. Pye Telecommunications, the professional arm that built the two-way radios for the British police, ambulance services, and taxi fleets, remained highly respected and intensely profitable. Because commercial telecommunications required robust, uncompromising engineering and deep integration with British infrastructure, Philips could not simply replace it with cheap imports. Pye Telecom continued to operate successfully out of Cambridge, preserving the original spirit of the firm. But it was entirely walled off from the high street. The British public did not buy police radios. They bought domestic receivers, and in the domestic arena, the Cambridge name was dying. By the late 1980s, Philips made a final, brutal corporate calculation. Maintaining the Pye brand name in the British consumer market was no longer serving a strategic purpose. The Dutch parent company wanted to unify its global identity. They decided to phase out their inherited British badges entirely. There was no grand announcement. There was no public mourning. The decision was executed with quiet, corporate efficiency. Retailers were instructed to transition their stock. The catalogs dropped the Pye listings. The advertising campaigns ceased. A name that had once defined how the British public heard the voices of their nation was simply withdrawn from the domestic market. The retreat was absolute. The Lowestoft factory gates locked. The Cambridge assembly lines stopped. The service manuals were discarded. The dealers cleared their windows. The tuning dials went dark. The badge was retired. The Cambridge wireless went quiet. The name Pye did not entirely vanish, but it fractured along a brutal fault line between what the British public bought and what the British state required. On the high street, the consumer brand was effectively executed. By the late 1980s, Philips had successfully erased the Pye badge from domestic televisions, portable radios, and radiograms, a piece of furniture combining a radio, amplifier, loudspeaker, and record player in one cabinet. The Dutch multinational consolidated its European operations, and the Cambridge identity was no longer deemed useful for selling consumer electronics. The domestic empire that had once placed a meticulously engineered wooden cabinet in millions of British sitting rooms was simply switched off. Yet, hidden from the high street window, the professional heart of the company refused to die. Pye Telecommunications, the division that had built the two-way radios for police cars, ambulances, and taxi fleets, was simply too embedded in the British infrastructure to be discarded. It survived, passing through a series of corporate acquisitions. It was integrated into Philips, then spun off, eventually evolving into companies like Simoco, still operating out of the UK, still building critical communication networks. The university-grade engineering that W.G. Pye had instilled in his workshop in 1922 never truly disappeared. It just stopped talking to the domestic listener. Today, the consumer memory of Pye is preserved not by a multinational corporation, but by a dedicated, quiet network of British enthusiasts. On vintage radio forums, at amateur radio fairs in places like Harpenden, and in endless online listings, the original Cambridge-built valve radios that use glass electronic valves to amplify and process signals before the transistor era, are fiercely protected. Collectors hunt down the surviving 1920s Sunrise models, carefully restoring the intricate wooden grills, the openings through which sound leaves the radio cabinet, that first disguised the industrial reality of wireless reception. On repair benches across Britain, service engineers painstakingly replace the wax capacitors, components that store and release electrical energy, in 1950s Fenman receivers. They clean the switch contacts. They realign the intricate circuits. They bring the massive, heavy flywheel tuning mechanisms back to life, refusing to let the Cambridge engineering go quiet. The original Pye sets still matter because they represent an entirely different philosophy of domestic technology. An old British radio with a repaired chassis, a glowing magic eye, and a loudspeaker, the part of a radio that turns the electrical signal into sound moving through air, still pushing a rich, deep tone into a room, can do something a modern smart speaker, a connected speaker that plays radio and music through voice commands, cannot. It makes listening a deliberate, physical act. The weight of the cabinet, the warmth of the valves, and the precise momentum of the tuning dial, the scale that shows which station the radio is tuned to, demand that the listener respects the engineering. It is not an invisible, disposable convenience. It is a machine that asks you to meet the signal halfway. The physical geography of the Pye Empire has been similarly transformed. The massive manufacturing facility in Lowestoft, which once employed thousands, was eventually flattened, the site repurposed for retail and housing. In Cambridge, the vast Chesterton complex that served as the beating heart of the company's consumer and television divisions is gone, replaced by modern business parks and residential flats. If you walk along the River Cam today, there is very little to suggest that this was once the center of the British domestic electronics industry, a place that rivaled Chelmsford and London for wireless supremacy. But there is a surprise footnote to the Pye story, one that highlights the strange afterlife of corporate branding. Long after Philips had killed the Pye name in the UK electronics market, they resurrected the badge for a completely different purpose. In a bizarre twist of corporate licensing, the famous circular Pye logo, the same typography that once guaranteed university-grade radio reception, was briefly used in the 1990s and 2000s on cheap, imported blank VHS tapes and budget DVD players sold in British supermarkets. The name that had introduced the first British transistor radio, a portable radio that uses small semiconductor devices instead of valves, was reduced to a sticker on disposable plastic. It was a final, quiet insult to the legacy of the Chesterton factories. The story of Pye of Cambridge reveals a difficult truth about how Britain built, sold, and eventually lost its voice. It demonstrates the fundamental vulnerability of a domestic manufacturing empire when confronted by the ruthlessness of international corporate consolidation. Pye achieved its greatness because it believed in uncompromising, heavy, precise engineering. They assumed that quality would always protect them, but the global market did not want university-grade precision forever. It wanted lightweight plastics, cheap assembly, and disposable convenience. The moment the radio was unmoored from the sitting room wall, the rules of the market changed. The brilliant engineers in Cambridge could not rewrite the mathematics of global retail, and the Dutch accountants who replaced them simply did not care about the heritage of the badge. They built the infrastructure of a nation. They captured the voices of the BBC. They defined the post-war British evening. But in the end, the company was swallowed not because its technology failed, but because its business model could no longer afford the cost of its own excellence. Yet, somewhere in a quiet British workshop, the legacy of that excellence survives. It is there on a crowded repair bench where a Pye Fenman Thauen sits plugged into the mains, its dark walnut veneer polished, its internal valves glowing softly with heat, the heavy tuning dial moving smoothly across the glass scale, waiting for a hand to turn the knob and pull one more voice out of the air. See you in the next one.